With a pompous hiss that almost seemed like it wanted to imitate fanfares of arrival, all of the colossal doors leading into the inner council chamber unsealed simultaneously. In one singular swoop, the secure steel structures pulled out of the way, once again opening the previously isolated chamber up to the larger building surrounding it. Out of the individual doors, the members emerged in long, orderly files, which were roughly divided by the size of the council people lining up into them. However, unlike the way it had usually been in the past whenever the council finishes its session, especially its first one of any new composition, the members of this new galactic council were not greeted by the bustling masses of people living on the council station, welcoming their leaders after a long and presumably arduous session of governing. Instead, the large space outside of the chamber remained largely empty, populated only by the firmly installed statues of various Corwell species and the awaiting security detail, ready to escort each of the members back through the dangerous streets of the station to the relative safety of their private estates or other accommodations. Besides professional soldiers, only a choice few individuals were allowed out here at this time, often invited by the very council people themselves. Despite that rather depressing fact, the overall mood in the room was casual, to put it nicely. It was the oddest thing, not only considering the situation on the station as a whole, but also thinking about the tensions that existed firmly between many of the individual factions now making up the council, as well as those in between. There should have been some sort of nervous energy in the air, for sure, but there just wasn't. As if all of those things had suddenly ceased to exist right after the inauguration, many of the council people chatted it up like they had just ran into each other in the line before the register in a grocery store. And that strangely casual feeling hadn't only started now that they were leaving the chamber. In fact, the session inside.
Well, that was a glorious waste of a few hours.
Ajia Theonora, now officially councilwoman Ajia Theonora, sighed to herself as she quickly checked the time on her personal assistant. All in all, she couldn't say that she was thrilled about the way her first official council session had gone. Not because anything bad had happened, of course, but more because nothing had really happened. There had been a lot of talking and very little had been said. Mostly just platitudes and the vague hint that things would have to be discussed in the future. In her mind, said future was right now, after things had already been pushed back again and again during the ongoing election. Sadly, despite a lot of pushing, her and many of her like-minded council people had not quite managed to push the rest of the council to see things the same way. Though there had been many valiant efforts, especially on the parts of Zishadi and Morgoth. With a tilt of her head, the young Zadiatos glanced back at the Lugomordalar, who was using the same exit as she did, walking a few paces behind her. The Deathworlder's head was hanging down slightly as he walked. His clawed feet were dragging a bit with each step, and the huge digging claws that usually sat firmly against his chest, like a plate of armor, instead hung a bit loose, awkwardly shuffling and fiddling with each other. The usually ever-merry and bombastic man really looked downtrodden, and Ajia Theonora believed that she understood why. With James out of the equation for the time being, it had seemed a bit as if Morgoth had done his best to make up for his absence with increased boldness and energy, an effort that had, sadly, been in vain.
Now,
a calm voice suddenly pulled her out of her concentration, forcing her gaze back forward. In a dynamic that had gotten somewhat unusual these days, Ajia Theonora actually had to look up a bit as she focused on her mother, who was walking basically right in front of her. Judging by the way she was speaking, she seemed to be referring to Ajia Theonora's earlier displeased mumbling.
You can't expect the galaxy to change in a day just because you got past one hurdle. No work ever gets done on the first day. Everyone is still testing the waters, seeing how everyone else reacts, towing a few lines to figure out how to best work with all the others.
Magisteria's trunk encouragingly waved back to her daughter in a downward motion, though she didn't actually turn her head back to look at Ajia Theonora. She spoke with a certain air of knowing experience, and it actually sounded genuine for the most part. However, right now, that still did little more than annoy HFY.
Maybe that would be something we'd have time for if one of our members hadn't been literally sent to the hospital for a vicious attack recently, she replied, trying very hard to keep her voice at an acceptable level as she spoke to her mother.
Magistheria released a long breath through her trunk.
Well, that is a tragedy. He was planning to miss our sessions of his own accord in the first place, if I recall correctly, she replied, her tone still very trunk-wavy. Had things gone as he wanted, he would be in some temporary holding cell, just like your dear Aunt Apollodorina right now.
A displeased exhale that HFY had actually tried to hold in managed to escape her mouth right at the rims of her tusks at that, causing a mild hissing noise that she didn't even know she was capable of making.
A big difference between someone missing a session of his own accord due to a sense of responsibility and someone literally not being able to attend because he had to be put into a coma to heal,
she countered, her tone drifting further and further away from a politely conversational one. She could tell by the movements of her mother's ears that she was picking up on that as well. Feeling a sudden shudder go through her body at that realization, HFY lowered her gaze slightly, her voice turning more subdued and hesitant, as she added,
I know not a lot has been officially released about it, but the fact that he is still alive is a mixture of a testament to his skills and a sheer miracle.
Magistheria had begun to ever so slightly turn her head back towards her daughter, in a very slow and deliberate movement. However, as she picked up on the now somewhat submissive change of tone, the movement froze in place, leaving her looking a bit awkwardly to the side.
A miracle, yes,
she sighed. She made the half-sentence sound like a question, but clearly it wasn't one she expected any sort of answer for.
I suppose that is one way to describe it.
Her tone was unreadable to a degree, not really giving away what exactly she wanted to say with her sentence. Or, more precisely, what term she would have used instead of miracle. Briefly, HFY was quietly pondering how she should, and could, respond to that, if at all. However, the decision was soon made for her, as a far less subdued voice spoke up from right behind her.
Bite your tongue,
Morgov said. No, demanded rather intensely in a tone that even HFY wasn't quite used to coming from the man. Magistheria stopped in her tracks. The constant flapping movement of her ears stopped briefly, almost as if she needed a moment to see if she had actually heard correctly.
Excuse me?
She asked, once she seemed to have convinced herself of that much, and the turn that had stopped halfway earlier was slowly finished, as she stepped in place to bring her head fully around to look back at the Deathworlder.
I do not believe you are a part of this conversation I am having with my daughter.
Morgov released a firm huff and shook his body slightly, causing some of the scales on his back to rattle. Unlike during his earlier slumped posture, his digging claws were now firmly pressed against his chest, and his tail had rolled up into its tightest possible shape.
If you are speaking in a way that everyone can hear, everyone can give comment to what you say,
he said, his tone remaining firm and constant, as he lifted his face up to look past HFY and directly at her mother, who still stood a good chunk taller than he did, despite his already enormous size. He, however, seemed undeterred by that.
In fact, I personally see it as my duty to speak up whenever I hear something worthy of criticism, no matter if I was a part of it.
Suddenly, HFY found herself feeling trapped between the two metaphorical fronts of this entire conflict. And as much as she had felt like tension was necessary during the strange and uncomfortable casualness just moments ago, she now suddenly felt like this specific version of it was absolutely not what she had wanted. Magistheria released a rather disparaging sound out of her trunk as she gazed down at the Class 5 with a gaze of annoyed superiority.
And just what exactly would I have said that you find so incredibly objectionable?
she wondered in reply to Morgoth's quite obvious challenge. And, of course, given the general volume that a sire such as that of the people involved in the altercation brought with it, it was already drawing the attention of basically everyone in the room. Council members, soldiers, and invited companions alike stopped where they were and turned their attention towards the two squabbling colossi. Curiously, they eyed the scene as one of the bedrock members of the council found herself directly confronted by one of the most recent additions. A core welder and founding species, the Scifi was one of the main representatives of the values and virtues that had forged the community into what it was now from the very beginning. And, as the only Class 5 Deathworlder, the Liga Mordalar were often seen as that which was bred to most firmly stand out, nay, deviate from those very things which, supposedly, made the community up from its very core.
Are you trying to insult me or yourself with that question?
Morgoth retorted, not giving an inch of ground, even as many judging gazes were thrown his way by a good number of the less amicable council members.
Why, Magistheria replied in a cold voice, raising her volume even further now that everyone was listening either way.
By now she was entering full politician mode.
Because I dislike speaking of miracles? Well, forgive me, but I am a woman of fact, not one of spirituality.
Morgoth's nostrils flared widely as he released another puff of air.
No, I would not call it a miracle either.
He first concurred with her statement, though then he quickly turned it around on her as he kept going with,
I would call it absolute testimony of humanity's willingness to not only live and die for what they believe in, but to also do what they can to preserve that life to keep fighting for as long as they can make possible for themselves.
Shifting his weight to stand at his full height, the man then lifted his arm towards the Scifi, almost as if he reached out for a human handshake.
Would you agree, councilwoman?
He asked in a prompting manner.
Or what would you prefer to call it?
Now suddenly finding herself put on the spot, Magistheria pulled her head back a bit, the flapping of her ears becoming slower, as her eyes narrowed at the outstretched hand.
It is certainly...
She began to speak slowly, clearly putting her words into place in her head even as she said them.
Beneficial that such an attack was conducted on the one member of this council who was predisposed to survive such an assassination.
Over the course of her sentence, she slowly seemed to gain her rhythm back, her statement becoming more confident with every word she spoke as she relaxed her stance.
Such augmented attackers would pose a more than significant threat to any normal person they came after.
She finished her point and crossed the ends of her trunk in a small closed spiral.
That his own augmentations were apparently sufficient to survive is truly testimony to his species' willingness to fight.
Fiona swallowed as she heard the tone of her mother's voice right as she spoke those last few words. There was a sharp blade hidden in there, one that was ready to cut anyone who dared touch them. This whole thing, this fight between door and frame, she didn't know how productive it actually was. Sure, these were the sorts of things that they would definitely have to discuss in the council, and she certainly understood Morgoth's point about speaking up when he had the chance to. Still, with a nervous gaze over at her mother, she felt like doing it like this wouldn't really lead them to where they wanted to go. Would it? Yet, somehow, she found herself not daring to speak up about it. She didn't really know why. Despite some unpleasant experiences, it wasn't like she ever had this much trouble talking back to her mother in the past. But today, something she couldn't name was staying her tongue. A feeling in her gut and scratching over her back that kept her standing there, just looking at Morgoth as she awaited what he would reply to that.
Ooh, it was a fight.
A new voice suddenly joined in the conversation. It was, in its nature, far quieter than the other two, who had been exchanging words so far. However, its tone was in no way any less cutting than that which Magistheria had just used. But that wasn't even the main feeling that came along with it, as the words were said. No. More than anything else, HFY could really only give one name to the sound that the man's statement carried with it, as the comparatively tiny human walked up to the scene with slow, deliberate steps. Absolutely done. According to orders from an earlier day, he had still discarded the masking part of his uniform, leaving his brown eyes free to look straight ahead. He didn't bother lifting his gaze to look at the Zodiatos. If his expression was anything to go by, he didn't want to strain his neck for her. Pretty brutal, to be honest. I managed to kill 2 of them, and somehow that was just enough to give James a fighting chance. He continued his recollection of the events. Most of the council members who were still quietly listening in shifted a bit in discomfort, as the soldier made it clear that he was not only there for, but had actively participated in the thwarting of the attempt on Councilman Aldwin's life. The way he so casually spoke about killing didn't seem to sit quite right with some of the more delicately strung representatives of the galactic government. Still, it was damn close. One wrong move and he would have been done for. Hell, he would have been done for had the madman not injected himself with who knows what in the past. The idiot had more adrenaline than blood in his veins when we managed to drag him to the medbay, which, honestly, seems to be a hobby of his at this point. The soldier continued on, unperturbed. When he had reached her, First Lieutenant Admir Rexer finally tilted his head back, though he still didn't look at Magisteria, instead keeping his gaze directed towards Morgoth and HFY. Of course, the experienced matriarch didn't allow herself to be perturbed by that. Keeping her voice high and curious, she simply commented, "You sure have an interesting way of talking about one of, if not the most important dignitary of your species, soldier." The lieutenant simply scoffed through his teeth. Though the displeasure was still clearly evident in his voice, there was now a hint of near wistful amusement coming along with it, as he simply stated, "Well, I think I earned it. He was a huge pain in my ass back in the day." Then he released a hollow sigh before shaking his head and running a hand through his brown hair. "Either way, I want to make it clear that those people were out for blood, and I will be glad to show the recordings of my cam to anyone who doubts that." He threw into the room. Clearly he didn't address Magisteria herself, but instead offered it as a challenge to everyone who stood there and gawked. And as the slightly flabbergasted council members were left to process that, yet another voice inserted itself into the conversation. This one was situated in a similar range of volume to the humans. However, it spoke in a far lower, smoother tone. "I hate to interrupt, but the time is running rather short," Tshirt said, as he smoothly stepped up to Admir's side. "We have places to be, my dear Lieutenant." "Of course," Admir replied, briefly twisting his head to the side to cause a shiver-inducing crack from his neck, before then using a finger to sort out the collar of his shirt and jacket. "Councilwoman, Councilman, if you would." He then requested up towards HFY and Morgoth. Morgoth, seeming satisfied with the resistance he had offered, agreed near instantly with a nod of his head. In a smooth motion, he dropped down from his upright stance, landing in a quadrupedal posture so he would be closer to the human's level. Meanwhile, HFY was still somewhat stunned for a few seconds longer. In the corner of her vision, she could see the subtle change in her mother's expression. The matriarch was clearly unhappy about being disregarded like that. Although, it did not seem like she was going to comment. For now. Finally, she managed to somewhat tear herself loose from the shivering feeling running down her back. Shaking her head, she briefly rubbed the ends of her trunk along its base. "Yes, of course," she confirmed. Internally, she scolded herself for freezing up as she had. Was she really becoming less secure now that things were finally getting serious? She felt more than just a little pathetic. Still, she at least tried to carry her head up high as she walked with her allies, allowing the security detail assigned to them to take the lead as they moved on to further important appointments. "Now remember," Nicola said, fully taking on her role as Cisatrix, as she moved in front of the camera, speaking with her hands just as much as she did with her mouth, while subtitles would later take over the job of communicating what she said to those who could not hear, giving her the freedom not to sign her words. It is incredibly important that you vet the sources of your news, no matter how much you may trust the people who are bringing them to you. I don't demand that you just listen to what I say, and you should not believe anyone who does. Down below, we are going to link to some useful resources that can help you learn how to vet sources. Lifting one finger to count on her other hand, she began to list. Stuff like, how do I know if an article was thoroughly investigated? How do I find out more about an author? When it comes to scientific Her sentence stopped short as she noticed her words slipping. And, instead of trying to salvage it somehow, she simply stuck out her tongue as far as it could reach and released a low groan, giving Simon a brief chuckle behind the camera. She knew he would just keep it rolling. They were going to cut around it later. Scientific literature. It is not that hard, Nicola, she complained to herself. With a sigh, she leaned her head forwards, throwing all her hair down so it hung like a curtain over her face, only to then comb it back with both hands as she stood back up straight. With gentle pushes, she brought everything back into place as she took a deep breath and prepared for another take. Let's try that again. We're rolling. Simon confirmed her earlier suspicions with a twirl of his hand, indicating to just go for it. Exhaling, a brief puff and getting her game face back on, Nicola looked right back into the lens. Stuff like, how do I know if an article was thoroughly investigated? How do I find out more about an author? When it comes to, motherfucker! She burst out, as her second attempt was interrupted by the loud whooshing of the room's door as it opened with impeccable timing to perfectly cut her off. Though she then quickly slammed her hand over her mouth following her outburst, her eyes widening a bit as she realized just who had come walking in there. I am still surprised you humans say that too, to be honest, Councilwoman Tharavel commented, as she elegantly walked into the room, putting one of her bird-like feet in front of the other in a smooth motion that made her body sway almost wave-like. Out of all the expletives, I somehow always expected that one to be more uniquely Parisian. Nicola slowly lowered her hands away from her face. Briefly, she glanced over at Simon, seeing that he had cut the camera for the time being, and was just leaning over to mark the place in their script as a needs reshooting. The freshly baked councilwoman looked at the elaborate setup of lights, microphones, and the camera itself with some intrigue. Meanwhile, her entrance was closely followed by the person who had become somewhat of a shadow for the newly ascended politician. Conglorch's steps were a lot weightier than those of the Parisian as he lumbered into the room behind her, his eyes quickly scanning around to take everything in, before two of them settled on one human each. Even though hanging out with this caliber of people had long become somewhat commonplace for the two young influences from Earth, Nicola couldn't deny that she still felt like it was something special to simply stand right before one of the people who were governing the entire galaxy. A hint of a blush dusted her cheeks at the thought that she had just cursed at the top of her lungs at the councilwoman's entry. Well, we humans have gotten quite creative with all kinds of profanities, Simon commented, once he had put everything on standby, leaning back onto his hands. Somehow he seemed to be far more relaxed about all this. How can we help you? Tharavel briefly clacked her beak and walked a few steps closer to the two of them, before settling down into a semi-lame position so she could more easily speak to them despite the height difference. Well, to be completely honest, the Parisian then began to explain, and her voice had a hint of lamenting to it, as she sighed deeply while she made herself fully comfortable in this new position. This first council meeting was rather disappointing. Her flattened tail, which lay on the ground horizontally with the flat side down, gave a single flapping flap against the floor. Meanwhile, the whiskers growing out of the back of the beak mask covering most of her face jittered in the air, almost as if electricity was running through them. Now everyone is doing their best to pick up the pieces and do something responsible with this newly granted influence we all enjoy. She continued her explanation. However, at least for today, I personally didn't make any major appointments.
Not for a lack of willingness, but simply because no worthy opportunity really arose for me, and I didn't feel it necessary to tack myself onto someone else's as an attachment.
Nicola nodded, understanding that much. Though it was in entirely different dimensions, she sort of knew the feeling of not wanting to act as an accessory to the person who had actually been invited somewhere. And since she expected that the actual answer to their questions was still coming, she left it at that nod and just listened.
At first, I thought I would simply resign myself to a daunting day of rest,
Tharavel continued on. Some humour entered her voice, as she pretended like taking a day to rest would somehow be a huge burden. Though it changed into a certain fondness, as she turned her head to look at the Licitor behind her, and continued with,
"But then, Konglorsh gave me a better idea."
Konglorsh released a bellow, of which Nicola wasn't quite sure if it was displeased or amused.
"I only asked at her if she wanted to complain to somebody else,"
the armoured lizard corrected. One of the claws on his right mauler tapped the ground rhythmically, almost as if he had energy to spend.
"It still gave me the idea,"
Tharavel countered, and then turned her gaze back towards the humans.
"I figured, if my time is going to be wasted by the council, then yes, I may as well complain about it to everyone."
She crossed her arms in front of the upper part of her chest, pushing some of her dense feathers apart in the process.
"I mean, the per diems that we get as council members aren't exactly a pittance, and we get paid basically to talk and reach a result," she explained further. "I figured, why not give the galaxy a sort of itemized receipt? Tell them what they paid for."
Slowly, things started to click for Nicola.
"Right. And you want us to help you with the publishing side of that? Help you get that out to the people?"
she surmised, and tilted her head a bit as she looked up at the Paracene's head.
"I figured it would be better than trying to go through the editors of the press," Tharavel chuckled. "I thought it might allow me to add a bit more of my personal touch to it. Though I understand if you are busy."
Nicola briefly shot another look towards Simon, who was already looking back at her. He just gave a bit of a shrug, though his expression sort of spoke a different language.
"Our upload schedule isn't that strict," she blatantly lied, giving a tiny shrug of her own. "And I like the idea of putting everything out there. Honestly, it's weird enough that the whole council meetings aren't televised already."
"Yes, well, I believe the councils of the past enjoyed their freedom to speak openly within the council chambers,"
Tharavel said, clearly holding quite a bit back behind that sentence.
"Yes, we are lucky to have those who are willing to make them uncomfortable now,"
Konglorsh chimed in a tone that sounded like he was referencing something, especially since Tharavel reacted with an amused bob of her head. Nicola assumed it was simply about all the new council members for the time being.
"Well, I guess the first thing we should think about is the exact format you want your exposé to be,"
Simon spoke up, action-oriented as always.
"Do you just want to write it out as a blog? Though that would need people to have the will to actually read through it. We're probably not going to get a whole video essay type thing written and recorded in a day. Maybe a podcast format would work. Though we'd have to make sure you have someone to really bounce off of to keep it interesting for the listeners."
Nicola smiled and began to think about the possibilities herself. Yeah, they were going to make this good. Carefully, Dr. Schramm used his gloved thumb to put gentle pressure onto the area between radius and ulna of the severed limb. It took a bit of feeling around, but eventually he felt the hard resistance of something that wasn't quite supposed to be there in a human arm. With some coaxing, he was able to find its tail end. As all the muscles of the dead appendage had long relaxed completely, he was able to slowly push the thorn or spike or spur, he wasn't quite sure what to call it yet, up, so that its tip emerged from the small, barely visible pocket on the wrist. The thing was nasty. Covered over and over with hooks that were smooth on the inserting side, but wicked on the extraction. With a probe, he checked the base of the thing, prodding into the pocket to see just how it was attached in there.
The first thing he noticed was the tough-as-hell skin on the inside. That was likely necessary to even be able to pull these things back in without ripping everything.
The normal skin that had presumably covered up the pocket previous to the spikes first emerging told of that much. He couldn't see much of the actual attachment, though. Would probably have to cut it open for that. The X-rays had been inconclusive.
No metal there,
he mumbled, as he moved to instead inspect the spike itself. He was very careful and made sure that his gloves stayed secure at all times.
Probably harder to detect.
Even if the dose of the venom these things were supposedly laced with he would get from a single small cut would likely not be all that dangerous, he preferred to not test that theory. The spike itself seemed to be made out of some medicinal steel, or maybe titanium. It was hard to tell with the bare eye.
Makes sense. Helps getting through controls the less metal there is.
First Lieutenant Bartar commented behind him. She was acting as one of his assistants today, mostly because the people she reported to had a lot of direct interest in the results of his work. Not that he couldn't have reported them himself, but he understood a hint of caution given the sensitivity of this whole thing.
It must be very hard to work with.
His other assistant then commented in a monotonous voice. It sure was a boon to have who was most likely one of the galaxy's leading experts on cybernetics around, even if Dr. Schramm could also count himself among them.
If only the spike itself showed on the X-rays, that means there is no wiring either. The nerves must be connected more directly.
Schramm nodded slowly, lifting his hands up as he suppressed the urge to scratch his chin. He was beginning to get the feeling that they, despite all their expertise, may just have been the wrong people to ask here.
Must have been one hell of a bioengineer. If that is the case,
he murmured, his eyes scanning over the severed limb once again. Way back in the day, when augmentation has still been more of a hot topic, even among humanity itself, these were the sorts of things its opponents brought up as what-if scenarios.
I think there may not be an implanted attachment at all,
he posed as a theory, though he was really more thinking aloud than actually sure of that.
Maybe they were grown in place.
Next to him, he could see the black body of the cyborg twitch up a bit.
Would that be possible?
Curie asked directly, seeming somewhat doubtful of that idea. Though they had also admitted before that, while they were an expert in biology-machinery connections, their immediate biological knowledge wasn't nearly as far developed.
It should be,
Tuya replied quite quickly, surprising even Dr. Schramm with how swiftly and confidently she had given the answer. As he turned to look at her to express that surprise, she cleared her throat briefly and looked slightly awkward.
Well, at least according to James, if I understood him right, she added,
her confidence feigning a bit.
He talked about it?
Dr. Schramm wondered, surprised that his patient would have had the time to talk about anything deep like that before succumbing to his condition after the brutal fight he was in.
Tuya shook her head.
No, but about something else. In the past. Like inserting things into human bodies genetically,
she explained, seeming reluctant to go into really deep detail about it.
He said not everything he talked about would be possible, but he was sure a good part of it could be done. And, I mean, I may be a layman, but this seems on a similar-ish level to a lot of that.
Dr. Schramm nodded. Judging by the kinds of things that he had found swimming around in Mr. Allwyn's blood, that man probably knew what he was talking about on that front. Though it left him to wonder, if that was indeed the case, was the hope of making it harder to detect really the only reason whoever designed this opted for biological attach and deployments rather than just implanting them?